Welcome to this very, very special effort, ladies and gentlemen. It's not often that we give way to debates and have conversations. But this one is a must-have. It's about this book, which is India, Bharat, Pakistan. The author is sitting right next to me. This is part 2 of his trilogy. And he is somebody who needs no introduction. So JSD, a good friend, Sai Deepak, good to have you with us. Namaste, namaskaram, how are I? India, Bharat, Pakistan, constitutional journey of a sandwiched civilization.
Right.
Now this sandwiched civilization is clearly Bharatam.
Right.
Now let's come to book 2.
Right.
The premise of this book.
Right.
See, book 1 set it up. As you understood, we understood civilization, coloniality, and of course our constitution. Okay. Am I right or wrong in saying that it all started in trying to understand where is the genesis of our constitution? That's where your journey started?
Correct.
You took a detour. Rather than moving ahead, you've actually gone back in time.
Right.
So let's start from there. Why?
So, as you rightly said, the entire trigger for this particular exercise, which I don't think is partly academic, it's academic come civilizational and very, very personal in terms of the learning that I have gone through. So, this was meant to be a trilogy, with the first part covering the period from 1492 to 1919, the second from 1920 to 1951, and the third from the first general elections to 1977. That is almost until the end of the emergency period. So once I was done with the first book, and I started the second book around Vijayadashami of October 2021, I struggled to move beyond 1800 words from October to January. Now, this was not because of paucity of literature or material with me. I had enough material to last me for another 5 or 6 books. But somehow the flow wasn't right. And I felt that I was being mechanical in my conversation after the first book, which is to say, it's done until 1919, let's take it forward from there. Some crucial element was missing. I would call it creative epiphany, but since I'm a believer, I would call it the hand of providence. Which is one day, I think, around December, January, when I was getting ready for court in the morning, suddenly I felt that I need to go back. Because you see, what I'm covering so far, at least as part of the first book, was the European Christian angle. But the partition of Bharat has more than one player to be attributed to. So which is the other hand, and what is the genesis of the other hand, I needed to look at.
Right.
Now, therefore, you're looking at the proponents of the two-nation theory. Now, you see, there is enough literature on Sai Deepak Khan. Correct. There is enough literature on Jinnah.
Yeah.
Some of the finest books that I have read so far is, of course, Dr. Ambedkar's Pakistan or the Partition of India.
Yeah.
It was written around 1946. But a much more, let's say, researched book would be Venkat Dhulipala's Creating a New Medina.
Yeah.
And this focuses on the period from 1937 onwards. So you see, the most well-known characters and faces come to the fore, which is Jinnah and others. But I genuinely believe that the answer did not lay either in Jinnah or Sai Deepak Khan, because I felt that there was a thought continuum, which is to say, if they were taking a thought forward, did they create it, or were they merely, let's say, torchbearers of a pre-existing thought?
So where did the genesis
come
from?
Yeah. And therefore, I went further and further and further, and this took me to Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. And therefore, the period of 1740, which is after the decline of the Mughal Empire began, after they lost miserably to the Marathas, and after the death of Aurangzeb. For all practical purposes, you can treat Dakhan or Deccan as the graveyard of Aurangzeb. For all practical purposes, no wonder he is buried there.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then the brilliant intellectuals that the Muslim community threw up, both in the Middle East or in Arabia, and in this part of, let's say, the world, which is the Indian subcontinent, the Bharatiya subcontinent, there was something simultaneous about it. And it was not simply coincidence, because both the individuals, Abdul Wahab and Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, were contemporary students of Hadith in Hijaz.
Wow.
This is exactly what I've shown.
You have.
So therefore, they were taking forward a certain thought process that they themselves had received. And turns out that this thought process went back to the 9th century.
Hanbali.
Yes, Hanbali movement, Ibn Taymiyyah. From there it goes on. And therefore it has multiple schools of thought, multiple diversities, but then the broad nuances go back to the basics, which is follow Islam in the manner it was followed by the early converts to Islam. Now then you look at the exposition of the two-nation theory in the pre-colonial, pre-European idiom and language, by Shah Waliullah Dehlavi very clearly says this is the case. He makes out a case for the existence of a khilafat or a caliphate. Khilafat, we typically assume that no, it's a resistance. No, it's not. Khilafat means caliphate.
Khalifa, having a Khalifa.
Exactly.
So this entire Khilafat movement in the 1920s was also about Khalifa in Turkey or try and protect the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. Yeah. Because they were effectively saying that the purpose of their faith is to break the existing social order inside out. Because according to them, as you see on banners everywhere in these days, Islam is the solution. And therefore, the way to achieve it, so if that is the end, the means to that end is jihad.
Okay.
And it needed to be given a particular political structure. That political structure is the creation of the caliphate. So that there is one Chhatrapati from their end, which is to say one umbrella, a single unified command under which different leaders and different Muslim rulers can operate. That process needs to be understood, and the theology, political theology needs to be understood if you want to make sense of Khilafat movement, if you want to make sense of two-nation theory. You cannot understand the partition of Bharat without Khilafat. You cannot understand Khilafat without understanding Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. Therefore, I had to take the detour. And I said, okay, let's now try and merge the first book's timeline and the second book's timeline. So this goes from 1740 until 1924. So therefore, the narrative of the first book is taken forward only by 5 years, as opposed to the 20 years that I had in mind. But now I'm so much more clear in my headspace as to from here how the entire narrative goes. Because I have the British line, European line, Christian line, then I have the Arabian line, the Islamic line, how they merge, and how Bharat is therefore stuck between India and Pakistan.
So sandwich civilization comes to the fore because India was under attack and it went through, and perhaps as a civilization compared to the Americas, we went through 2 rounds of colonization. So the Mughals and of course then the British, and then you had the Portuguese and the others also coming in. So we were continuously under attack. But I'm just going to jump. But before, did it shock you that it started with the Wahhabism, the whole thing with Wahhab and Dehlvi? They were all connected. Did it shock you? And there was also a connect to the Farezi movement in Bangladesh. It was all somewhere connected.
Correct. The thing is, we have all heard smatterings of each of these pieces of information in different places.
Yeah.
But until you get down to actually reading it properly, and then you say, are there dots to be connected? Or are you looking for ghosts where none exists? So I decided to literally piece the literature together. And I said there is no way that these connections can be missed for anyone who looks at all the literature together. So the best part about the existing literature is, and I must actually say this, I hope it's not a self-defeating point, my book is not original in the sense of, let's say, the literature already having existed. So you have Sri Seshadri who's written on the point, you have R.C. Majumdar who's written on the point, you have Qayamuddin Ahmad who's written on the point. Everybody's written on different verticals. But like I did in the first book, the job of a lawyer is to bring everything together to look at the macro picture and to say, how does it read? That assuming that I were to move out from the nuts and bolts, from the trees to the forest, and I'm looking at it from a 60,000 feet perspective, is it too difficult to make out this particular shape and this contour? So therefore, I had a very concrete basis to putting all of this together. So quite a few things shocked me for the simple reason that at one point, I've always been a vocal opponent of certain things which were propagated by Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. But I also felt during the course of this reading that he is blamed for things more than he deserved, especially with respect to the Khilafat
movement.
The fact that Khilafat had achieved a certain degree of traction before him, with leaders like Tilak and Annie Besant supporting it, and specifically making a case for Ali brothers, is not something that's usually discussed in popular discourse. There's a reason for it because he magnified it and took it to a very different level altogether. That's a different issue. I'm actually trying to make the case that Gandhi was made Mahatma by the Khilafat movement. He rode on the backs of the Khilafat movement and the Khilafatists. That much becomes very, very clear. So this kind of, let's say, learning has now given a very different perspective, which is to say you will need to reevaluate your heroes and villains, so on and so forth. And there's a lot to be learnt from your detractors.
Yeah, and it's not about passing opinion per se, but to know. Because unless you know where you are coming from and what all contributed to where you are, how do you know the way forward? So in that case, you also realize that you will have to ease on the legalese in terms of the language, because book 2 is a little more easy to read.
So if you read
was that feedback, or did you also feel thoda zyada hi?
No, so here's what happened. So I'll just take about 30 seconds on this, because the process has improved my ability to reach out to the audience in a more lucid fashion in writing. One, I love speaking, and then I've been in litigation for close to 14 years now. And therefore, that rigid form of writing comes to fore. So, of course, I practice only as an arguing counsel, but then when you summarize your oral submissions in writing, for the court to consume, you still pack as much as possible.
Correct.
So the first book went through around 7 rounds of editing. Even then, it was not enough because, you see, I wanted to stick to a language I'm most comfortable in. So that at least the message is not compromised on in the process of loosening the language. So I said, I'll take that risk. And most importantly, the sense of heft is also conveyed thanks to the language. Because you see, one of the objectives of the first book was that it must reach academia. Because those ivory towers, according to me, had to be completely impregnated. People had to actually open up to this particular literature. That was one of the purposes of it. In the acknowledgement to the second book, I've clearly said, I've taken into account all the feedback. I've tried to tell the lawyer within me, thoda shant ho jao, keep the gada down, and engage with the reader. And let this not be an exercise in self-indulgence. And so I've thanked them. The good part is the effort has paid off because a lot of readers have said, this is such a refreshing way of reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt it myself because the first of India, that is Bharat, the first 20, 30 pages, I said, boss, this is like legally. So I'll have to really go back and read that line again to make sense of the line. And then, but this one has been far more easier to read and to comprehend. Maybe perhaps we have also warmed up to your style. So that's another point.
Possible.
But congratulations, I believe 25,000 copies already.
So the first print run is done of 25,000 copies. Usually the first print run of every book is about 5,000, 10,000 copies. And to be fair, India, that is Bharat, has created a captive audience of about 90,000 readers.
Lovely.
And out of which, therefore, it's no surprise that within almost a month, the book was launched on 23rd of August. We are today on the 30th of September. So the first print run is done. The second print of 10,000 copies has already sold out 3,500 copies already. So now, I would say, this is the Marvel effect in play. You've read the first, you have to read the second. If you want to read the second, you have to read the first. So the sales of the first book have also gone up. But I've been told that notwithstanding the length of the book, which is almost twice the size of the first, they found it even more readable. And so much so that hardcore history buffs are saying once you're hooked to the first 2 chapters, you race through the rest of the book.
Correct.
Because it's gripping. And I've been told that after that, the structure of the book effectively helps them process everything that's there. So this is how you structure written submissions in the court.
Well, whether you agree or disagree, you got to see once you got to decide once you read the book yourself. But it's very interesting, and let's come back. Now, you said it's a continuum. So I'm just going to jump and ask you about, is this continuum witnessed even 100 years later after the Mupla riots and even the Khilafat movement? So the 1920s to 1920 to 1924, that period. Now we are in 2022, so literally about 100 years later. Do you see the thought continuum manifest?
100%.
Will you associate the crackdown on PFI to something which is existing? Everybody talks about Salafi, Wahhabi. So this is from based on what you're saying, from the 18th century then?
So there are 3 levels of response. If you remember, on one of your TV debates, on one of your programs, when we discussed the CAA, I specifically mentioned that during the CAA protests in Kerala, they had taken out processions, hearkening back to the Khilafat saying, we haven't forgotten 1921 and we haven't thrown our swords into the Arabian Sea. But that means in their headspace, there's a very clear collective memory on the basis of which they're working. Second, the phase where I speak of the Mopla outrage, I've stopped using the word riots in the context of Mopla because riots shows a level of parity. This was properly a genocide. There was no parity here. It's a massacre. And the word used by the British records very clearly is outrage. And there it so happens that the Khilafatists would wear uniforms and take out protest marches. That's exactly what the SDPI and the EPFI are doing right now. Because they know this has a recall value and a fear recall. It creates a fear psychosis. They're aware of it. 3, this is the continuum of the Wahhabi thought process. You see, it's around the 90s when suddenly Indian literature started speaking of Wahhabism, saying it's a new infusion into Indian Islam because of Gulf money pouring into this country. Until then, Indian Islam was effectively the product of Sufism and all that. That's what they were saying. This is such uninformed nonsense. Allow me to be candid here, because you see, Wahhabism has existed in this country since the 18th century, mid-18th century. And that it was spread with a fantastic network being created by Syed Ahmad Barelvi. I specifically pointed out across the country. And those parts of the country where they had very established seminaries which were created around his period and after that, they continue to be the flashpoints.
So there were an Ali brothers even then.
Exactly, from Patna.
Patna.
And Patna's earlier name was Azimabad.
Azimabad.
That's exact. So how, let's say, short-lived our memory is, that as a community and as a country, perhaps we suffer from this kind of, I wouldn't say country, because different communities seem to have different levels of memories in this country. So I'd say as a community, Bharatiyas in that particular sense, perhaps have poorer memory. We have fantastic amnesia. So there are parallels to be drawn. And I specifically say, you try to ban the SIMI, you have a SDPI and PFI.
Yeah.
You do this, some other organization will come about. They went after, let's say, Hafiz Saeed, he created a new organization.
Correct.
So you're trying to go after the form as opposed to going after the substance.
Yeah.
And I've compared this with the Raktbeej Asura, as far as the Hindu Puranas are concerned.
Correct.
To say,
one drops, another comes.
Exactly. So you have to find a way to contain it so that not a single drop of blood ever touches the ground. And that's only possible if you eliminate the seed itself in terms of the mindset. That mindset needs to be called out. Economics is not the way forward. It's not going to help. So there are different ways of doing it. I've suggested a few ways.
So this thought string is largely Sunni sect driven. So was that this continuum, did it have a position even against Shia and Sufi? And let me also ask you, now we know Deoband, we know Barelvis, we know so many other sects. Did they all come from the same thought continuum?
Exactly. So there are about 6 to 7 movements which came directly from Dehlavi's thought process. And there was another movement that was a contemporary of these movements, called itself an intellectual successor of Dehlavi, but was looked down upon by everybody else, Ahmadiyas.
Ahmadiyas, okay.
Okay. Now here when we speak of the CA, we have bleeding hearts in this candle saying, we have to protect the Ahmadiyas of Pakistan. They were one of the founding communities of Pakistan. Pakistan was created by largely the Shias and the Ahmadiyas because of the growing clout of the Sunni Wahhabis who were making it difficult for other rival sects to survive. They were issuing death warrants against these communities. So they said, you want this, we'll go some other place. So when we suddenly say, no, Shias are okay, the difference is, it's Sunni Wahhabism, there's a problem. What are we talking about? Syed Ahmad Khan's master stroke was to actually bring both these rival sets of Islam together under a single institution, which is the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, now known as the Aligarh Muslim University. He decided to have courses for both because he said, you guys keep fighting with each other, the Hindu will come up and he'll again take back state power. Our job is to ensure that the British man stays in this country so that both of us can collaborate to keep the Hindu out of state power. That's exactly the purpose of the movement, and he says as much. The good part of what I have done as a lawyer, and even if I say so myself, is I have not paraphrased. I have quoted.
Quoted everybody.
I have said, dekh lo, pad lo, soch lo.
Soch lo. That's what you've done. So, but you made a statement even on the 1857 mutiny, where largely the whole issue is that Hindus and Muslims came together to fight the British. But you make a case that the Muslims are largely under this Wahhabi movement. Came there because they realized that this is the time to strike back. And they were actually doing it so that they could bring back the rule of Islam in India.
That's why they wanted Bahadur Shah Zafar back. They're fighting for the parcham of the Mughal flag. That's it. See, it's like this. The Wahhabis, effectively by that time, have a stronghold in the Northwest Frontier Province. Okay. And of course, it wasn't a province then because it was made a province only in 1901. It was a Northwest Frontier. So Sitana and all these places, the Swat Valley is where they have this. Malka and Sitana, which is where you effectively associate the Taliban with. And I've shown the roots between the Deoband
Taliban is also an offshoot of the Deoband. Now, it's also written that Mullah Omar was a student
of one of the seminaries.
Seminaries of Deoband.
Okay. So they have their, let's say, their stronghold there. So what they decide to do is that when the mutiny so-called starts, now obviously the British Empire is busy trying to clamp it down because it's going on for 6 to 7 months. Right until 1858. So they use this period of confusion to attack them from the outside with the help of the Afghans. Okay. They are not on the same page as the mutineers, by the way, because they believe the mutineers are collaborating with Hindus, which is not what we want. And therefore, how the Wahhabis had a problem with the mutineers want the revival of the Mughal Empire. The Hindus think that both of us are fighting for freedom from the British. And we don't realize what's exactly happening until it comes to a point where there are, let's say, sporadic fights between the two factions during the course of the mutiny. This R.C. Majumdar captures it brilliantly. It hasn't received the kind of exposition that I thought it should have. Then I thought it's not good to actually cite only one author. So I went through Qiyamuddin Ahmad's book. So both of them agree that the Wahhabis were not fighting against the colonizer, they were fighting for revival. Similarly, there are portions where they agree that the Muslim mutineers were looking for revival of Islam because they had already given the fatwa for jihad. Now, the moment you call for fatwa and you call for jihad, you are not fighting for a secular purpose anymore. That's exactly where Sai Deepak Khan comes in. He tries to defend all the parties who are Muslim in nature, and he blames the mutiny entirely on the Hindus. He says the mutiny was caused by two people, Ram Deen and Mata Deen. This is his way of referring to Hindus.
So that's his reference to Hindus. Now, we've got limited time, lots of ground to cover, but two specific questions I'll come to.
Right.
You talk about the Christian Reformation movement, and you also talk about the Muslim Reformation aspect. And then you say that somewhere they are all connected towards just converting or attacking the civilizational ethos and changing perhaps the DNA of Bharat.
Right. See, the thing is, what translates to Reformation in Islam and Christianity may be different. But it always translates to terrible period for non-Muslims and non-Christians. That much is clear. Because Islamist Reformation movement says, go back to the basics. And the moment you go back to the basics, we have had hell. And when it comes to Christianity, their Reformation simply says, I will not accept the monopoly of the church over my religion. And therefore, we should be allowed, specifically the Catholic Church, and therefore we must be allowed to create multiple denominations. But then it translates to competitive Christianity and competitive evangelization. And therefore, the moment it translates to competitive evangelization, you're looking for fresh areas to convert. Harvesting souls. Therefore, the net result, you can keep reforming till the cows come home, but it effectively means we are going to have hell.
So that's the impact on India, because both sides have let's say both these forces.
Non-Christian, non-Islamic civilization is not exactly going to be treated properly the moment either of these mindsets think of a reformation. Final two questions. One is the Sedition Act 124A. This started somewhere around 1919, if I remember correctly, or Wahhabi period, 1863.
1863 itself.
Yes. So every time we have a discussion on sedition and popular discussions, we are being told this was for Gandhi, this was for Patel. No,
it was not.
Gandhi was not the enemy of the British Empire. They clearly saw him as a friend. For the better part of it. Okay, and they saw him as a moderate. Although he thought of himself as the extremist of that particular period, he was the Manas Putra of Gokhale. Okay, who was the staunch moderate, textbook moderate. This was not for us. Because the Congress was desperate to prove its non-seditious nature in every resolution. So why would you need sedition law against them? Not needed. The extremists such as Tilak and everybody else were the ones who ultimately did this. But the obvious reason, where the historically recorded reason is, this was to curb the Wahhabi movement. So if you read the language of section 124A and you look at the parliamentary debates around that particular period as to what are the activities they wanted, you will realize that every limb of section 24A is referred to there, saying or this, indoctrination. Then let's say collection of funds. So anything which is aimed in a particular direction, which is to initiate war against the king or the queen. See, prior to section 124A, you had section 121, which is for waging war against the king or the queen. When you already had that, why did you need 124A? Because it's not just the final act of waging the war. Every step that leads towards it, from financing to indoctrination, needs to be curbed. That's why the provision came about.
My final question, in contemporary times, are you worried about what's happening in India currently and what the disposition's approach is? Is there a worry for you that what the Congress did with Khilafat back in 1920s, the BJP could be doing today?
I've been fairly unabashed about the fact that the book is not an archival exercise in analyzing the past. It is to see if the past continues to be relevant. Unfortunately, so it is. And therefore, I've consciously made this responsible statement that we are living in the age of Khilafat 2.0. My only concern is perhaps we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Because 23 years from the end of the Khilafat movement in December 1924 led to 1946 and 47, partition of Bharat. We don't want that again. We have had enough of partition. We don't want more bloodshed, at least as far as the people of, let's say, the native faith systems of this country are concerned. We have seen enough. So my only exhortation and hope is, let's not operate under a savior complex where we believe that the failed methods of the past will somehow result in new outcomes and successful outcomes just because it's a change in dramatis personae. Makes no difference. And I've also said that Congress is like a pretatma. That DNA moves from body to body. Now, which is the body that is currently possessed of this particular spirit and which needs to be exorcised? I'll leave it to the audience's imagination.
Well, you said without saying it, and there is more in this. Is there a solution? What are the ways out? What we need to do? All of that is mentioned in the book. But one thing that he says is that we've got to do it together. 1%, 2% cannot do it. As a civilization, as a collective, as Bharat, we need to do it. Sai Deepak, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Namaste.